video on brake job. This is the rear on a 2015 Jeep Grand Cherokee. If you have one, you're familiar with this. I've taken the wheel off, as you would imagine. I've got the car on a hydraulic jack. You should put a jack stand under it. Mine is in use on the other side of the car. First thing is that I did the other side of the car and found that getting the rotor off was really tough, and when I did spray some penetrating oil on the inside, it did help a lot. So I'm going to do that first, and then I'll go on and do the caliper. I already did the driver's side, and the rotor was a bear to get off. I hammered it and hammered it. I finally put on some penetrating oil, and that actually did the trick. That got into just enough of the built-in rust on the inside to release it, okay? And I'll do that first because I'm going to do the rotor or the caliper right now. Very quickly, what you need for this repair, you need parts. So there's a rotor, and this is a caliper, which you'll have on your car, but I'm showing the two disc brake pads on the inside of those. You'll need some chemicals. There's a brake cleaner. There's a penetrating liquid wrench penetrator. You've got the blue thing, which is disc brake quiet. I'm just going to put that on the back of the pads just to keep them stuck in place. The gray thing is an anti-seize. I'm going to put that all over the rotor. I need a C-clamp. They're the blue thing, and you use that to compress the piston. I've got a hammer. I'm going to need that later, I'm sure, to whack that rotor because it's for sure it's clamped on. There is an 18mm socket in the middle there, which I need for the caliper mounting bracket removal. I've got a big screwdriver there to remove a pin. I've got a 7mm hex wrench right there to remove these two. There's two pins. Well, I'll show them later, but see there's a pin in the middle there. That is a caliper guiding pin, so you need that. And then I've also, I thought I had in here as well, but you need a very small screwdriver to take off an O-ring that's on the hub. Okay, so let's see, and I'm not wearing gloves, but you probably want to wear gloves. Bring a lot of kitchen towel, and there's a spring that attaches to the brake pad. It just keeps it in place, stops from rattling around. Just take a screwdriver and put it here and push, and the spring comes right off. There are two, if you're doing just the pads, there are two caliper guiding pins which you need to remove. I've got the loose mounting bracket from the other side here, and you can see where the caliper mounting bracket bolts are. If you're doing rotors, you need to take those off. Do that next, but first take off the guiding pins, and the guide pins go through this hole here, which is on this side through this rubber boot right there. You can see a little bit of a black tip on the end. That's just a hard plastic cap that you need to remove. You can pry that off with a screwdriver. Cap looks like it just comes right off. Next, take a 7mm Allen key or hex and get it into this boot right there, and inside will be a bolt. There is the end of the bolt coming out right here. So don't release it all the way, just let it sit in the rubber boot. Well, what a hassle that was. There's hardly any space between the caliper bolt and the car over here. So what I had to do was get I can't even get that out hardly. I got the socket in there with the hex, as you can see, but I could not get a wrench on the end. So I just wound up getting a little wobble unit, and I just had got enough to crack the thing open. Then I did it all by hand with a wrench and the socket. Once you get the caliper off, it exposes the caliper mounting bracket, and so there's a bolt in there. You can see I've got my socket on there already, and there's another one right there. Okay, so just remove those two. You might need some penetrating oil depending on the car. I found the same problem with the caliper bolt as I did with the caliper guide pin. So I've got I broke the I put on penetrating oil, put on a ratchet socket, 18mm, whacked it with a hammer and broke it. Then then I've got a ratcheting wrench that I'll remove the caliper bolts with. Just wiggle the caliper loose, it'll come off. You can either hook this up to some part of your car on the inside. I find this is just, there's enough room in these Grand Cherokees to lay these things down. Just be careful with the hoses. Don't dangle these things loosely on the hose alone. Try to not touch or bend or break, do anything to the hose. Take a very small screwdriver and just wedge it here. There's a plastic or rubber O-ring that keeps the rotor on, so just pry the O-ring off and put it away. Now the rotor comes off, and this actually feels like it's going to come off with a couple of whacks. So the penetrating oil really helps to get in there. There's a join here between the outer part of this is called a hat rotor, the outer part of this rotor and the inside wheel drum, and through here where the two surfaces join, and that's where all the the gunk and rust and stuff builds up. And you might have to just hammer this a lot actually before you break the seal. There you can see where the penetrating oil got in. Maybe you can't see it, but it got in all through here, and I think it did help to unseal this. And you can see where all this rust, this rotor was basically fused to that hub. All right, make sure you use a lot of brake cleaner on the new rotor, front and back, and then wipe it down with towels. It comes from the factory. There's a lot of gunk around it. From all the trouble I had getting the rotor off, I put a lot of anti-seize just on the inside of the disc, and I put some on the hub as well to clean up a little bit. So I brake cleaned all around here and just took some paper towel and cleaned it all up. And I know that I went, and not on the bolts, but around the face plate here, I just put some anti-seize because that's where the rotor got jammed last time. I'll put some on the rotor as well. Remember, put the O-ring back on. There's the new bracket versus the old one. So you can see how thin the old one is. It was ready to be replaced, and there's the new one. It's about 1.5 centimeters thick versus almost nothing on there. Then you need to retract the piston right where my thumb is. The piston is what pushes out of the caliper, and it gradually over time pushes in and creates the braking force, and then it retracts a little bit, and it gradually goes in and stays in as the pads wear down. So the piston eventually just comes out probably a couple of centimeters. Right now it's retracted to about half a centimeter, or a centimeter or half an inch. Okay, so what I do is I've got this U-clamp, nothing special. You can buy a special tool for this. You can use U-clamp. I put the old worn down brake pad on the piston, and then I just put the clamp on and then keep pressing until the brake pad hits the metal part, and that means the piston's fully retracted. Then also, before I do this, it's wise to open up the hood of the car and just open up the fluid reservoir for the brakes, and then that'll just relieve any pressure, because you're pushing the piston back into the brake system, and it builds up a little bit of pressure on the brake fluid. Piston fully retracted. What I like to do as well, I like to give my caliper just a quick brake clean, just to get rid of the gunk. Why not? Attaching the caliper mounting bracket. So there's the bracket, there are the bolts. So what I like to do is put a little bit of anti-seize, sorry, getting late, anti-seize on these, run it through the threaded fitting once, a couple times, just till it runs fairly smooth, because there'll be lots of hard spots, and that kind of cleans it out and makes it easier to get off next time. The caliper bolts, take those out and buy a special purpose caliper lubricant. It's the thing to worry about here is these rubber boots. If they come into contact with particular lubricants, particularly those that are petroleum based, these boots fall apart, right? Or they gum up. So there's the caliper grease is particularly made to not react with the rubber. So just coat the guide pins here, pull them out, and be very generous, and get them nice and lubricated, and clean them off beforehand. You can put a little bit of grease to smooth the way in on the back. This is the rear, or they call it the inside mounting, the inside brake pad. That metal fitting there will slide into the piston that we just looked at. And then down here where my middle finger is, you can put a little bit of lubricant on there like anti-seize. There's the inner brake pad mounted inside of the piston. Mounting bracket back on. The bolts, so the bracket goes on the inside of this fitting, and then the bolt goes in from the outside. All right, so those bolts are in, and if you're torquing, torque these to about 75 or 80 foot-pounds. Just reattach the caliper onto the then the outer pad just slides into this bracket here. I like to put a little bit of lubricant on these. The reason is that the caliper will start squeezing as the brake pad starts to erode. It needs to slide on this this part of the bracket. So it's nice to have a little bit of automotive brake grease. Right. And then fit the caliper back on. It should fit nicely. And then with the caliper bolts, just put your socket back in here, and then just keep. You might have to wiggle this a little bit for the bolt to match up with the hole. Okay, but hope you get it in there. And then what I found with these with this Grand Cherokee, boy, that lower. I'll try and get back there. That lower caliper bolt is just a pain to get at because there's hardly any space between the bolt and the rear of the car. So what I wind up doing is using a pair of pliers, and I manually squeeze it in. What you could get around that by buying a special tool that doesn't have a like a deep or a lot of distance between the end of the socket and the rear of the wrench. Okay. So those guys are in. If you're torquing, torque that to about 30 or 35 foot-pounds. Then remember the little blue caps that came off the end of the caliper. I didn't clean this. I will actually, but then they just go on the end and they just slide in, and they just stay automatically.